CURES is sponsored by Wheeler Health's Better Choice program. More at wheelerhealth.org.
Helping you lead a healthier life. This is CURES.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the CURES Show, where we explore the cutting edge of wellness from credible sources for our mind, body, and spirit. And at the time of this taping, it's a Wednesday, so we always like to do a little free therapy Wednesday, a little mental health boost. And this is a big topic, especially around the newsroom here. Are there things you're doing that are contributing to the anxiety of your kids? You might not realize it, but are you actually contributing to make them more anxious? So I'm sure we're all guilty of it a little bit. Dr. Laura Saunders is a psychologist at the Institute of Living. She's also a mom of two, and she's joining us so we can quit making our kids so anxious. Hi, Dr. Saunders.
Hi, Kara. How are you?
I'm good. So is this, I know you don't want to blame parents, but there are a lot of things that we might be doing that could be making our kids more anxious.
Yes. So a couple things I want to mention here. Number one is that research shows that millions of children struggle with anxiety, okay? Sometimes as high as 20% of youth worldwide. It can manifest itself in different ways, right? We talked a little bit on Great Day that, this isn't perfect rule, but it is fairly common that females tend to be more internalizers of their anxiety and males tend to be more externalizers. So they come off as more angry and aggressive and assaultive, whereas females tend to be more internalizers. They hold on to their anxiety. It causes them more physical symptoms. So that's two pieces of information. I don't want parents to think they cause their child's anxiety. It's that their child has some underlying vulnerability towards anxiety. It could be genetic. It could be for any number of different reasons. So they don't cause it, but there's things that parents can do to not worsen their child's anxiety and to hopefully lessen it.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just do a quick definition check. What is anxiety? We all say, and I know a lot of people do have anxiety, but a lot of people will say, oh, I've got anxiety. It's my anxiety. My kids say, but really, what is anxiety?
So anxiety is essentially excessive worry, a level of worry and distress that is beyond what a situation calls for. Now, anxiety is not necessarily a bad thing. Some amount of anxiety or internal pressure before a deadline makes you kind of study a little bit more or work a little harder to get to the deadline or, practice your skills before a game or a sporting event. So anxiety by itself is not necessarily a bad thing.
Okay.
So it's that excessive worry or pressure, but it's when it becomes just that excessive or hinders your functioning or is debilitating that we want to have a bigger plan to address it. That doesn't mean that small, lower levels of anxiety should be ignored either. And I think one of the most important things that we can do is often label it. So because sometimes, your child, your son, your friend, whoever it is, acting out in a more like maybe verbally aggressive manner is actually a sign that they're experiencing anxiety more so than just, going off.
Yeah. All right. Name it to tame it. But let's talk about, as parents, some of the things that we're doing that could be actually making our kids feel more anxious. And number one, you say we really shouldn't encourage avoidance.
There is more and more research coming out all the time between the brain-gut connection, right? So there's a direct brain-gut connection. And one of those points of connection is anxiety. So people that feel anxious often have stomach aches, nausea, body aches, what we call somatic complaints. Now, those somatic complaints are real. I'm not saying they're not real. I'm not saying they're in their head. I'm not saying they're faking it. They might feel nauseous. They might have a stomach ache. They might have tightness in their stomach. Or sometimes it could come out as a headache or an arm ache or whatever it is. Those pains are real. But what we need to do is understand their origin. That stomach ache or that nausea even though we've had a whole rash of norovirus, is not necessarily a sign of a bigger physical problem. It's not the sign of the flu. It's not the sign of a more serious virus. It's a sign that you're anxious. So always letting those children stay home from school is detrimental and in fact sort of enhances the anxiety. Just a couple of days ago, I got a call from someone who saw me on Great Day and essentially described, amongst other things, an attendance problem with their child because of a lot of physical complaints. And I said, those physical complaints are highly likely to be anxiety. I think you need to address it as anxiety. So, just letting your child stay home every time they have a stomach ache or a headache or their jaw aches or whatever it is, it's labeling it, that's anxiety. I understand that you don't feel well, right? I'm not invalidating their symptoms. Their symptoms are real. However, it's not a sign, it's not, you don't have a fever, you've not thrown up. And sometimes even when you do throw up, that's anxiety, but it's not a sign of a bigger medical problem. The best way for you to deal with this is to get to school. If you can't get through a couple of periods, you go to the nurse and you check in with the nurse if you need a break, right? To have a different strategy. It's not to avoid going to school in this situation.
Okay. So you would force your kids to go. You might offer them some Tums. Doesn't matter why you have a stomach ache. The treatments could be the same. Yeah. And you would say, okay, at least get through a full couple of classes. And then, if you really need respite, you're not calling me, you're going to the nurse. And the reason being is they start to learn that they can get through it versus I need to stay home every time I don't feel good.
They learned to tolerate and manage the anxiety and discomfort. And again, I'm not saying that these physical symptoms aren't real. They are real, right? We've all had this, before a big deadline or something, a big thing I have to do. I'll be like, ooh, my stomach's feeling kind of tight. But I know that it's anxiety. I know that it's not because I have a bigger physical problem. I know that it's anxiety. So I acknowledge that's what's going on. What do I need to do right now to help myself feel better? Do I need to drink some water? Do I need to go for a little walk? Do I need to take some deep breaths? Do I need to, do some mindfulness? Do I need to do some visualization? I know I need to do something, right? But I'm an adult, and children and adolescents don't necessarily have that toolkit yet. But the worst thing you can do is just say, okay, stay home again today.
Yeah. All right. The other thing that we do as parents is sometimes you say we shouldn't shy away from conversations talking about feelings. We really need to talk about those with our kids.
Yeah. I mean, I say all the time, the way that we manage these things is by identifying what's going on and then talking about what can we do to sort of fix this and really putting some responsibility on the child or adolescent to say, okay, well, you're not feeling great or what's wrong. How do what's bothering you? I don't know what's bothering you. Okay, well, I've noticed that, the parent shares an observation. I've noticed that you've not been wanting to go to practice or not been wanting to go to dance class or had difficulty going to school or not been doing things with your friends. Is there something going on in that area? And so you're trying to at least engage in this conversation. And I will say from personal and professional experience, often the kids say, I don't know, or no, that's not it. Okay, I tried. But then a day later, 2 days later, you revisit the conversation again. You are sending the message that I'm open to talking about this. There's things that we can do to dig a little deeper, develop a little bit of introspection in terms of what's going on. We call it theory of mind, understanding how you feel, understanding the feelings of others. So there's things that we can do that really encourages your child or adolescent to dig a little deeper and be a little bit more introspective.
Okay. Also, you say we can trigger anxiety in our children when we are overly cautious about life.
As I said in Great Day, taking your child, wrapping them in bubble wrap and keeping them in the room might in fact prevent anything bad from ever happening. However, they'll never learn a thing. So within reason, letting your child do some things. I hate to always go back to the old days, but in the old days, you'd leave your house, you'd go on your bike, you'd be out for hours at a time. Oftentimes you'd get into some mischief. I had, three brothers that got into a tremendous amount of mischief, but they learned from those things. And then, thankfully nothing really bad happened. And the more that you experience things, the more you learn. So if we're overly cautious, we don't let our children try things, or we're constantly saying, don't do that because this bad thing could happen, or don't do that because this bad thing could happen. I know that bad things could happen. I could come up with a scenario of something bad because I've seen it or worked with someone from a lot of different sources. However, the only way children learn is through experiences. The only way they build confidence is through failure experiences.
Okay, so if we're really worried and you say smoking will give you cancer and disfigure your face, it can kill you, or going in the ocean, I'm using that example because a lot of people are afraid of the ocean, but I can think of my mother-in-law saying something like, don't do that, you'll get this, every story of don't go doing that, you could break your bones and you'll never recover, or don't put your face like that, it's never gonna. So all these things that we say, whether they're true or not, is actually contributing to anxiety.
Well, it's certainly not helpful in a lot of situations. Now, it is true, there's been lots and tons of research that smoking causes very serious health problems, right? I don't want children and adolescents, I definitely don't want adolescents smoking and vaping. I can remind people all the time, vaping is really bad for your health. However, there's a lot of adolescents that tried vaping and then didn't like it. And so then that lesson's much more powerful than the adult or parents, not letting them leave the house to be with friends because they might start vaping, right? Do you see how it can get carried to an extreme?
Yeah.
And honestly, I saw a lot of this during COVID, and for that 18 months afterward, parents who were, became so deathly afraid that their children were going to get COVID when we knew actually children and adolescents were the least at risk. And I understand that they could pass it on to other people, but essentially not letting their children have any experiences for that protracted period of time really inhibited a lot of social and emotional learning. And so while, yes, COVID was serious and deadly for some people, smoking and vaping and, riding your bicycle too fast or riding your bicycle down a hill or, whatever it is that you do or want to do, bad things can happen. Playing on the monkey bars, the great majority of children, I have a bunch of nieces and nephews who have broken their forearms on children's playgrounds, on monkey bars and all, playing kickball and all sorts of things. These things happen, and I don't want them to happen, but thankfully we live in a modern society where you break your wrist from playing kickball because you fell and it snapped, you go and you get it fixed, right? This is not 100 years ago where you didn't really have access to those things. So it's not being overly cautious in allowing our children some experiences, because that's what builds their confidence.
Okay, so I had a question before I did this show. One of our anchors here, Nicole Nalepa, said, well, what does it matter? Does it matter if you're worried privately? So you let them do something, but you don't say it.
Okay, so that I love that, and I love Nicole, and I love that. And yes, we can carry and manage our fear, right? It becomes especially poignant when you have a teen that's a driver, right?
Right.
I carry a lot of worry about my, certainly when my kids were closer to that age. And we can carry that fear. But if every time they get in the car, I say, make sure you do this, make sure you do that, right, I'm not managing it. So if you truly can manage your worry, and then again, you have the experiences, okay, they've done this a bunch of times and it's gone okay, so I can breathe a little deeper and breathe through it and not and allow myself to not worry so much. So if you can manage it truly privately, that's great, but I think a lot more of that leaks out than we think.
Right. And so what you're saying is it can contribute, even if your kids are looking at you like, Mom, you're so weird, that's never going to happen. But when we are saying all these scary things, it's not as effective as giving them information, is what you're saying.
Right. I mean, it's true that driving can be dangerous. It's true that driving over the speed limit can be dangerous, right? There's a lot of things that can be dangerous. riding your bicycle too fast or not wearing a helmet or, whatever it is. A lot of things can happen and we want to manage our own anxiety, but that leads us, to the kind of the next thing that parents sometimes do, and that's refusing to cope with their own anxiety. Right?
Yeah.
We all have some amount of worry. The instant a child is born, or you're a caregiver for someone, you're going to have some amount of worry. That's, being caring and loving. It's when it becomes excessive. It's
Okay.
when your own anxiety or your own kind of obsessiveness gets projected onto your children, and now they're carrying your anxiety as well.
So that means if we're not managing it, our kids are watching our body language, and too much exposure to our anxiety actually teaches them to be afraid of certain things.
Yeah, we unintentionally teach them to be fearful of everything. Again, I've worked with parents who wouldn't let their children go over to someone else's house, ever. And I said, well, I can understand some level of caution, and certainly when you have, a child under, really any age, but, wanting to connect with those parents or meet with those parents. But, I think allowing them to do some of these things, I understand, because this is what often comes up, something bad happened to you in your own childhood, and now you're taking those things and refusing your child the ability to do anything, right? So that's an example of not managing your own anxiety or not dealing with your own trauma or whatever the issue is, and projecting it onto your children and then trying to keep them in the plastic bubble wrap.
Yeah.
So it is acknowledging your anxiety. It is acknowledging your own obsessive thinking, and really looking at how that impacts your child.
So what do you do if you're really nervous and really scared and you want, I'm going to go back to my mother-in-law. She's probably not listening to this, but she had some trauma, right? Her father died when she was 12, stung by bees, stung to death. So, he was 36 years old. He stepped on a hive. She was 12. So I think it's manifested her whole life where it's like the kids are going, to the beach and they're jumping off the rocks. No, they can't do that when I'm here because I can't handle that. She's just really afraid of a lot of things. So if we're that type where you're afraid of a lot of things, do we just stop our kids from doing things, or how do we manage that better?
Right. So that's an excellent example of how your own trauma, anxiety, excessive nervousness, excessive worry has an impact on your ability to look at a situation and evaluate the risks of a situation more clearly, right? Going in the ocean or, doing some of those kinds of things. And, that's a tragic situation that happened, but a very, very low probability situation. People get stung by bees all the time. And, that kind of a bad thing doesn't happen. And I'm very sorry that happened. But that's a good example where your own issues then impact your ability to use judgment and reasoning to truly evaluate the risks of a situation.
Okay. We're going to come back and talk about how we sometimes send mixed messages. We're taking a quick, 20-second break to hear from a sponsor.
Struggling with gambling? Wheeler Health's Better Choice program offers personalized support and treatment to help you regain control. Visit WheelerHealth.org to learn more and take the first step towards recovery today.
All right, I'm back here with Dr. Saunders. We're talking about how our own anxiety or not managing anxiety can kind of just bleed over onto our kids. We're not really helping. We're contributing to them being anxious. Not a good intention. I know that's not what we want. So, Dr. Saunders, excuse me. So I needed that to happen. So how do we sometimes send mixed messages and cause our kids to be more anxious?
Right. The classic do as I say, not as I do, right? That's like the parent who smokes cigarettes and then tells their teen not to smoke cigarettes, right? That's a classic mixed message. Now, you can say that they shouldn't smoke cigarettes, and you shouldn't be either. But there's many things that we do as parents. And I do like to remind myself and everyone, parenting's the hardest job in the world. The great majority of parents do the best they can with the tools that they have and the emotional resources that they have. But a good parent does require self-reflection, and it should parenting at its core should bring us to the point where we look at either how we were raised or how we did things and not want to make some of the same mistakes. So it is about being consistent in your message. It's like telling your children the only way you're going to succeed is by, good grades, good grades, good grades. You need to have good grades, and then putting so much pressure on them that it sort of has a negative cascade effect. So it's just trying to be really consistent in your message, not perfectly consistent. I'm not perfectly consistent. Probably you're not perfectly consistent, but really trying to do that good parenting, right? The concept is called the good enough parent. Be the good enough parent and do some measure of self-reflection, see what mixed messages you're sending, and try to dial back on some of those mixed messages.
Yeah, I think I want to highlight that. You've said that before, the good enough parent, because if we're just trying to be perfect at everything and stressing about it, we just create stressed out perfectionists. So let's talk about the grades. That's a big one. I was just talking about someone else in the newsroom where he's worried his wife is checking the Power School all the time, and, oh, you have this missing assignment, you got to do this, you got to do that. And the man in this case was like, you're kind of going to have to let him fail because he's got to learn how to do this. He's in 9th grade. But I understand that fear both ways because I'm the school checker. I'm the one who gets all the alerts. And you're like, what are you doing? You have to get this in because you know that doing well in school is important, especially for kids who want to go to college. So in the world of us bleeding over our anxiety, how do we handle that when we know that kids aren't doing what they should be doing at school?
So I don't often use this word and I don't always like, but I'm going to use it now. It has to do with balance, right? It's knowing your children, right? Knowing that child A is pretty self-motivated and for the most part, they've got a lot of internal motivation. They generally do the right thing, really dialing back with them and not constantly reminding them of all the things because they keep on top of it. Child B in a given situation is that child who's not internally motivated. In fact, while we know that good grades gives you better options for school, they are not long-term thinkers and they don't care so much in the moment, and they're certainly not thinking about the long-term consequences. And it's being a little bit more vigilant with that type of children, but not overly vigilant. When you're sitting with a 9th, 10th, 11th grader, you're sitting down with them, doing their homework or monitoring all of their homework, that's becoming a little bit of a problem. And while I don't want my kids to fail either, having some of those experiences where you missed a deadline and then the teacher says you missed a deadline, and they're really much more flexible about that kind of, teachers are much more flexible about that kind of stuff these days than they were certainly when I was in school. They're like, okay, I need you to work on this and get it in. Allowing some of the consequences to happen where they belong. So the consequences of not doing your work and not turning things in at school are you have poorer grades, or you have teachers that remind you, or give you consequences, or you have detentions, whatever it is. So letting some of those consequences fall in place, because those natural consequences are really the greatest learning.
Okay. Can we do natural consequences in the form of punishment? Like if you have missing work, you don't go out on the weekend? Like, are there consequences we should do at home? Sometimes the teachers aren't as on top of it until it's really too late.
Yes, I mean, and again,
but that means like giving a consequence and not checking it every second on your phone when you get an alert that something's missing.
Yeah, so I don't want parents like micromanaging or lawn mowing any obstacles down. But really, looking at if there's been a pattern of missed assignments or 1 or 2 classes, now their grades have seriously dropped because they're just not doing the work. Yes, I mean, you might be taking their phones away. You might be keeping them in on the weekend. As a general rule, I don't like to take away sports and extracurriculars because those are very positive outlets for kids. But yeah, there can be certainly consequences for that type of more egregious behavior or egregious pattern of behavior. And then as a parent, okay, I'm going to need to be a little bit more on top of this. But again, that's not sitting down and doing the assignments with them and making sure they turn every single thing in and checking 3 times a day. And honestly, especially in high school, as they progress through each grade, allowing more independence and more of those natural consequences to take place.
Yeah.
Because you're not going to be going to college with them.
Yeah. So, it really depends on the age of your children. I know parents get really worried about video games, and they might be like, the kids always want to play video games. They're like, we're never having a video game machine in our house because bad things can happen, or you're never having social media because you might get kidnapped. What you're saying is kind of the never and always. If we start acting like that, we're probably not in that balance zone.
Yes, I mean, and we live in a modern society. We're not living in a, Amish community where no one else has any electronics and no one else has any phones and no one else has any, social access to social media. We have to live in the reality that we're in. And I do worry about extremes, all or nothing thinking, black or white thinking. It's more about providing guidance, providing supervision, using consequences when needed, but doing things in a more careful way as opposed to an all or nothing way.
Now, if we go to older kids, I think that teen parents, we worry most about, besides driving and stuff, but drugs, alcohol, bad influences. And I'm curious, in our 3 minutes left together, but if you're worried about that and anxious about that, that seems like a good thing to be anxious about because you need to stay on top of it. However, you've said it, I've heard you say also that teens are prone to experiment with certain things. So is that all or nothing, like you're grounded if I catch you doing this, or we want to keep that door open a little? Like, what's the right way that we handle it and be clear without just the you do this, you're going to die anxiety type thing that you don't want us to do?
Right. And as a general rule, kids don't, you see over time that your child's peer group is changing. You see over time that their behavior is becoming more irritable, withdrawn, negative, change in grades, right? You see over time that there's behavioral changes taking place. And there's something underneath that. And now since the beginning of time, high school kids have gone to a party and experimented with marijuana or alcohol or something. While I'm not encouraging that, it's also not the end of the world. It can be, listen, I don't feel comfortable letting you go to parties because you're not exercising judgment around using substances, right? So you can say that out loud and then have some restrictions, but that doesn't mean they're never going out again for the rest of their time in high school. They have to do some of this, honestly, in order to learn, and I just don't want it to happen in such a way that it's unsafe. But also you see a pattern of deterioration. It tends not to be one extreme or the other.
Well, all good advice. I think the bottom line is, if we have a takeaway here in the 30 seconds, we want to be good enough and we want to monitor ourselves, because got to check our own anxiety at the door. We might just be raising anxious children if we don't.
Right. Do your best to validate and emotions and feelings. Examine the expectations that you place on yourself and your children and whether or not they're realistic, and then adjust your perspective as necessary.
Dr. Saunders, thank you as always from the Institute of Living. Thank you all for being supporters of the CURES show and podcast. Always love it if you subscribe and leave us a review. Have a great day, everyone, and be well.
CURES is sponsored by Wheeler Health's Better Choice program. More at wheelerhealth.org.